one I think we need to keep in mind.
Right.
Because maternal health is also involved. If there isn't that choice, then there still will be action taken by women throughout the world, and including in Oakland.
Well, that's
who are
always
going to
very
hurt
interesting.
themselves.
That's very interesting because the assumption is that women didn't do this before we had
Of course
the
they
law.
did.
And that's certainly not true. I can remember holding a conference sometime back where African American women came together because the assumption was that African American women were just totally, absolutely opposed to anything like reproductive rights, that they simply were not going to go along with it. We held a conference and we did a survey and we got 99 plus 9% of the women who said they wanted that freedom. Didn't matter whether they ever used it or whether they wanted to use it, but they wanted that freedom. And indeed, they all had stories about what happened before there was the possibility of going to medical doctors to do what was necessary at that point in time. So it does open up things. And it opens up again. I don't want to sound like this is a story about men, but it also opens up for men the value of being part of families. You know, you just don't drop your sperm and leave. That you become a part of the family and that you have rights within that family and that you want to be part of the kids' lives and all the rest as well. And that you do get a chance to see that. And we have learned to not be so quick to make judgments about other ways of people living their lives. I think of all of the people that I knew years and years ago before we had any kind of openness about the issue of the gay and lesbian rights, to what their lives were like, living in the shadows, and what makes a difference when you can live as you yourself, as a human being, and feel that you are welcome as a human being in the society. So some things have opened up in terms of our ability to interact with people that we have never interacted with before. They've been on another side of the line from us. Anything else?
Well, in San Francisco, the council, the Board of Supervisors held hearings on this issue in 1998, and when they imported the principles of the Women's Treaty, which the U.S. has not ratified, into the code, the municipal code in San Francisco. That's one positive. And the other is that women's salaries have come closer to being equal to men's, not up to, but that's
still below, but it's much closer than it used to be before. And again, what's even more important is those salaries are earned in a much wider variety of jobs than they have ever been before. When we started at the EEOC back in 1965, there were like 5 areas where women worked. Anybody want to suggest what they were?
Teachers.
Secretaries? Elementary school teachers, yes. Nurses. Secretaries. Sales clerks. And that's it. You know, it was around child caring and somewhere around that, or jobs serving men for the most part in the jobs that they were in. About 5. And that's not true anymore. You can now see, I see my good friend Madeline Nixer here, who was with the Department of Labor for a long time in the Women's Bureau. And I can remember Madeline and I going down and trying to convince the union members that women could do some of those jobs that they did all during the Second World War. Remember that?
Yes.
Right. And to really say you can open. And as she says, it's still working. There are still people who are barring some of those things that we're talking about. Yes.
I think one of the things that we miss opportunities on who is working on our food products, who is working from the women's level. And I'd like to see more of that, where we give direction as to what we want for our families. This industrialized food has literally put our children at either living or not living. It's just, when I go into people's homes, I do environmental report on what's going on in the family, I see that kids are going to more doctors, more hospitals. The area that where they're living in is toxic. And we as women, we as mothers, we as grandmothers need to protect the children. So we need to get involved in the laws that are being put together for our food. And much of that control. And it needs to come from women because they're the ones who are bearing these children.
Okay. Yes?
One thing that I find very encouraging, and it really has a long way to go, but it's the whole thing like Greg Morton's and this school building in Afghanistan, and the did the micro loans and so forth. That there's the whole notion that if you help a woman out, if you help a whole family, you help a whole community. And I think they're starting, that's starting to spark. People are starting to see that, and that's very empowering, not only for women, but it can empower the whole communities, and children can get educated, that type of thing. So I think that movement is very encouraging. I like that a lot.
How many of you already knew that women did that? I think most of us who grew up in families recognized in terms of all the decision making that went on in the household, that a lot of those decisions were indeed being made by the women of the house, because they were the ones that were there. For the most part, the men were out of the house and not in the house. They were working outside. And I think we are now getting that raised to a level of understanding because we've had so much experience at it. Charlie?
I was going to address what Moffat said. I think actually in advancements, I know since 1970, or even when my daughter, who's 33 now, was in high school, what women are doing, and that's a big change in the positive, is that you have vegetarian selections wherever you go. And in 1970, you couldn't be a vegetarian outside of your home, not in the United States.
Yes.
You never carry your food with you. And now you can go any place and order a vegetarian entree. And my daughter had presented that into her biology classes, what you could do for world peace, and she said you could be a vegetarian. And the whole class laughed at her, but she had a whole scientific explanation of how if you stop eating cow, that actually is what's creating the environmental degradation around the world. And now that's more accepted and more normal.
A whole lot more accepted.
And then also words like riparian corridor. There's words that we didn't have, I think, in the general vocabulary that are now there. And what I've seen in the environmental movement is it's mostly women that are the point people on those issues. We say riparian corridor, we talk about watersheds, we talk about regionalism in relationship to water. There's a whole statewide tribal water commission going on. We worked for 120 years to get Native people to be addressing at the top of the front of the line, talking about the water issues in California. If they're not addressed, California's going to disappear off the map into a desert. And I think we're still in a place where we're still at a turning point where we can save the state environmentally. And that's actually happening. There is a tribal summits on water. The words like riparian corridor, everybody understands what I say when I say that word. We didn't used to say it, and I used to be laughed at meetings 10 years ago when I would try to introduce subjects like that.
How many of you grew up during the other depression? Okay. Yeah, it reminded me a lot of that because that was a period of time also where women did things in the household to change what people were eating and doing because they had to. There was no money to do a lot of that stuff. But we had a very much better diet. And kids went outside and played instead of sitting in front of TV and instead of sitting in front of computers and never getting outside. So we have already begun to change our lifestyle. A lot of it has been changed. And there is more change in terms of how young people are being brought up. Because they're being brought up like they did during the Depression. They're being brought up with the concept that they have things that they can do to make a change, to make a difference. That it isn't always what everybody tells you should do. You can get outside and do it. How many of you grew up in cities? Okay, I grew up in probably the biggest city at that point. That was New York City. And we used to play on what they called the stoop. And the stoop was, you had stairs on the stoop, so you could play all kinds of games. You just hit a ball, and you hit the ball at a certain place. It went out into the street, and there's first base and second base and all the rest. And the girls and the boys played together. Because you had to be where your mother could see you in those days, so there was part of it. So those were changes that we're getting back at. We're recognizing that we've got to move our bodies. You can't just be sitting all the time and doing those kinds of things. We have to be healthy in all kinds of ways.